Welcome to a new episode of These Go to 11. Let's turn it up. Hey everybody, welcome back to These Go to 11, an unchurchy conversation about everyday faith. Please make sure you like, subscribe, and review on your favorite podcast platform. This not only helps us to get our content out there, but also helps us to find out what you, our faithful listeners, think.
Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to These Go to 11. Once again, I'm Nathan Bell. Joining me as always, Greg Dutcher. Greg, what's going on, man?
Dude, Lisa said to me this morning, she knows that we're having all these authors and guests, and she said to me, you do know you and Nathan are putting yourself out of business because people are starting to catch on that they're going to hear actually helpful things from other people. Why did we do this?
Let's be real, Greg. We've only got 5 listeners anyway, so.
That's good. Thanks, Mom, Dad. I appreciate it. Although after those last couple, I don't know if they're still hanging in. So, but we actually are not going to waste too much time today, right, brother? Because we have sort of a always special guest that I guess we could start with. What's that guy's name?
It's debatable.
With? Yes. Yes.
Whether
And hello,
he's
Matt
special.
Smith. Hello, Matt Smith.
Hello
one of the
out
other
there.
pastors at CFC. How are you?
I am doing well. Great to be here.
Are you just trying to show off with all those books, dude?
These aren't even real books. It's just this.
That's all right. I joke with Matt often, Nathan, that Matt has read the first chapter of at least half of those books. Right? I've seen him skim that first chapter. No, that's always a pastor joke. But I'll tell you one thing, Matt. We might as well say it. If anybody's watching and saying, "Oh, I want to borrow a couple of titles,"
Yes.
would you care to share your plumber's analogy?
I surprise people. I have a no lend policy, and here's the illustration I use. If I was a plumber and I had my tools in my truck, and somebody said, "Hey, can I borrow?" I'd say, "No, I need that for tomorrow." So my policy is, if you want a book that badly and you'll read it, I'll just buy you the book. And then it's just clean. It's just clean.
See, and Matt, I'm glad you said it because I've actually seen you do that. You won't lend a book. Yeah. Well, I think that's where you learn to instate your policy.
I'm assembling right now in my mind the list of books I want to borrow from Matt.
Good.
Dave, I'll have you know, we're going to introduce you officially, but Dave, many of your books are somewhere on that shelf there. So
yes.
Well, thank you. I'm sure you rushed in and put them right there for the interview.
Matt, why do they hell have dust on those Dave Harvey books? What's the story there? Well, we have a very special guest. Dave has just popped in here. Dave Harvey, and Dave, I've never met you. I've read your books, and obviously, when sinners say "I do." I think has served many, many couples. Any couples out there that I have married would probably say, "Oh yeah, that's the dude's book. I read that book. Greg was always talking about it," because I thought it was just an incredible blend of good, sound theology with practical advice. And I have found, I think, Matt, you and I have talked about this before, with so many marriage books, they tend to gravitate toward one side or the other. There's books with a lot of practical advice, and they might talk about hobbies and interests, etc. And there's some books that have a strong theological vision for marriage. It's hard to find the two. Mm-hmm. So that's not the book we're really talking about. I know it's not your most recent one by any means. But that's my experience with you, Dave, is using your book as a tool to help prepare couples for marriage. But Matt, you have a little more connection with Dave. Historically, personally, you don't have to go into all of that, but introduce Dave.
Well, I know Dave because my previous church, Grace Community Church in Kingsville, which I love, was a part of a family of churches, and Dave was a key leader in that, and he was kind enough to invest in our local church and our leadership team, and so just benefited from his wisdom and teaching from afar, but the benefits of just kind of seeing them up close. And look, Dave, I'm imitating you. It looks like we got something. The gray is we're going. It's the Santa Claus look for Christmas coming in.
Yours is a little gray, and mine is a lot of gray.
Yes. Now, Matt, you're early for Christmas, dude. Because remember, this is a January podcast.
Oh, that's right. Oh,
but you may have let something, which I think most of our listeners know, the cat out of the bag here.
But Dave, could you tell us a little bit about? I know you have served in a variety of different contexts and leading. Where are you currently at, and kind of how are you currently serving?
Yeah. So Kim and I live in Southwest Florida between Fort Myers and Naples in a little community called Estero. And for about the last 5.5 years, I've been serving as the president of Great Commission Collective. It's a church planting ministry, a family of churches.
Mm-hmm.
And so I have the privilege of doing that. Still doing some writing. I serve on the CCEF board. And yeah, that's kind of what life looks like right now. Four kids and 6 grandkids.
Wow. Busy.
Yeah, and I imagine that has an impact on the Christmas budget too. But we'll save that for another time. Nathan wanted me to mention as well, Dave, that one of the things that we do, that we're privileged to do, is give away 2 copies of whenever we have an author on, 2 copies of their book. And so the one we've chosen is I Still Do. Which is a more recent version, a few years back, of the book I mentioned earlier. And Nathan will say more about that at the end. But could you just give us a little blurb on what you were doing in that book and why you felt compelled to write it?
Yeah, I Still Do operates as a kind of companion volume to When Sinners Say I Do. So I noticed over the years that when Sinners Say I Do was being used for premarital counseling, crisis counseling, and then just with newlyweds. But it seemed like that space for couples that had been through the first 7 years, like beyond the spot where marriages typically implode, and they wanted to stay together. There really wasn't a lot out there for how to, what are the defining moments that you confront when you decide to run the race together for the rest of your life. And so I just thought by that time, Kim and I had been married close to 40 years. We've been married close to 42 years now. Wow. But I assembled those into 9 defining moments, and that's what is in I Still Do. And so there's the regular I Still Do book, and then there's a devotional as well.
I love that. And we'll sort of use that as a pivot point, Dave, growing closer and stronger through life's defining moments. As we mentioned to you earlier before we sort of went live today, whatever you would call our official recording, we had let you know that this is part of our January series. We're doing a sermon series at the church Matt and I pastor, and we're doing a corresponding podcast series where we've been really privileged to have authors such as you here today to help us think through suffering, adversity, etc. So that's going to kind of be our general theme here, but as always, we'll let the conversations unfold. I know this is something you've preached about, written about, and lived through. And Matt, would you sort of take that as our starting point and ask Dave to set up this conversation?
Sure. I mean, a real pick-me-up topic here in January. Let's talk about hardships and difficulties. But the reality is it's not a matter of if we experience them, but when we experience them then. And so why has this really been something that has been on your heart, that you've wanted to write about, that has kind of been a part of your ministry to help people to not just know there's a God of comfort that walks through with them, but helpful things from Scripture that kind of shape how somebody thinks about suffering? So maybe you could kind of start us off a little bit about why this topic and why it's been kind of something that's been close to you.
Yeah, I think there's a ministry answer for that, and then a personal answer as well. On the ministry side, I've served pastors now for for many years. I mean, I think I've been in full-time vocational ministry for 38 years. And the thing about pastoring is a call not simply to proclaim the gospel, but to embody the gospel. So when Paul goes to explain ministry to the Corinthians, he says, "For we who live are always being given over to death for Jesus' sake, so that the life of Jesus may also be manifested in our mortal flesh." And so being given over to death is part of the call to ministry. And so, like loss and grief are just baked into pastoral ministry. And the challenge is a lot of guys sign up never even knowing that, beginning with me. And and so then you start walking through ministry, and you begin encountering the things that people encounter. You lose people, or you come under attack, or your abilities are picked apart somewhere along the way. And because among pastors feel things deeply, grieving and loss are actually part of the call that you've accepted from God. And so learning how to think about loss, learning how to grieve well and grieve wisely is actually essential to resilience. It's essential to long-term ministry. And so I think that's kind of on the ministry side. And then on the personal side, there's been a number of things that have happened in life and in ministry that have provoked seasons of grief and loss. But probably the most profound one was the loss of our 24-year-old daughter about 3 years ago. And for many years, she fought an addiction that eventually claimed her life. And so we experienced a great sense of loss, deep grief while she was alive. So I'm not talking about, after her death. I will talk about that in a second, but while she was alive, and we were all fighting this thing because, like for anybody listening to this that has dealt with the world of addiction, that the world of addiction is a world of chronic disappointments. While they are swinging in and out of sobriety. And I was just thinking about this afternoon when I was just rolling over like loss and these themes in my mind. David Paulison had an illustration of growth in the Christian life as a man or a woman walking up a set of steps with a yo-yo. And so your life is going up, your life is going down in this general sense of descent. Well, I was just thinking, how the world of addictions flips that upside down, and it's this descent down a set of steps with the yo-yo, as sometimes things are up and sometimes things are down, but there is this sense of descent, and with those who love them sitting powerless on the sidelines, praying that God helps them, seeking to retain as much of a relationship as possible, seeing the futility of the addiction, and recognizing that it's not delivering for them what it advertised, and just waiting for that to play out with the hope that they're not going to hit the bottom step in their descent. But in some cases the addiction takes them, and then that's what happened with us. And then you're not only in like a season of grief while they're alive, but then you grieve the loss of this wonderful life. And my daughter had a son who we are now raising. He's 4, and that's just an incredible beauty in our life as well. There's just so much blessing, so much grace, but honestly, we had to grieve a daughter that we lost, and we still do grieve that, but also we had to grieve a life that we expected to be living and wanted to be living as we got to this age that is no longer available to us, and come to terms with a different kind of life. So, long answer, but there's a ministry side to this and a personal side to this.
Dave, if I may, thank you for sharing that. And I know I speak for Matt, Nathan, and everyone who's watching or listening that, people sometimes wonder, is it too late? But just hearing that, our hearts are so touched by that for you and your wife and your whole extended family. Our sincerest condolences. And I think I don't know if I mentioned, but Nathan and I, when we started this podcast series, a few weeks ago, our first guest, not that any story is a carbon copy, but had experienced the loss of an adult child. And we, the lessons that I'm sure are experienced there that nobody ever wants to enroll in, that really sets up something I'd like to ask you. And that is, so often we hear that when couples go through something like that, the loss of a child in particular, that they don't make it. They don't get through it. I remember as a child learning of a couple that my parents knew that they had worked with and had lost a young child, and then found out years later they were no longer together. And I remember thinking, oh, why would that happen? It seems like they would pull together. I know that's a long setup for the question, but I really would love to hear your thoughts on how you and your wife, what you've experienced together in such a devastating loss, and how, by the grace of God, you have been able to stay strong and tightly connected.
Well, I mean, grace is not just a word. It's not just a biblical theme, but it is a potent gift from God that is there. Like when I dropped to the place that no parent would ever want to be, where you feel like you were at the bottom of a well. And I'm not saying this is the worst experience a human being can have, but it's a bad one. And only to discover that, you open your eyes and you look around and grace is there. Then, then you realize that the gospel has traction, and that God is even in these hard places, and is moving towards you in tangible and palpable ways. And so I think, the reality of grace is the first place my mind goes when I think about what's made a difference for Kim and I. I mean, there's no question that grief is like there are a number of things that are like this, but grief is one of them. Grief is like the velociraptor in Jurassic Park that's hitting the fence and testing the weaknesses of the fence. So grief attacks the weak points of the marriage, and it can push you apart. And so I think that there was a lot of conversations that we had, like within that first week, just talking about how we wanted to grieve and who we wanted to be for each other as we grieved, and that we weren't going to be over analyzing how each other grieved. And but if we saw each other stuck, or we felt stuck, we would share that as well, because grief can run cover for a lot of different kinds of sins. And because you're grieving, people give you an enormous amount of room. And so it's actually a very vulnerable position to be in, because nobody would presume to want to approach you, because you're grieving, and yet you are very vulnerable when you're grieving. And so I think that all these things were kind of spinning around, but at the very center was just it was the grace of God making a huge difference, helping us to live in the present, to grieve the loss, and then slowly reintroducing the future as something that he wanted us to move toward.
Mm.
So, Dave, when you know, I've observed this, I've experienced different realities of this, that often when people go through just their worst nightmare, something they never want to experience, their faith is put to the test. And it seems that when trials come, either we run to Jesus and we encounter that grace that you're talking about, or we have a temptation that we follow that leads us to become angry at God, to reject, to question our faith. What were just some of the temptations that you personally either experienced, kind of, walking through that process, and any comments you would have about just being vulnerable, especially to temptation when it feels like you're disoriented, when it feels like your whole universe just got flipped upside down?
Yeah. I think that one of the things that's becoming clearer to me as I grow older, as I go through, different experiences of aging, of ministry, and then have big, huge life experiences like the one we were just describing, is that I've come to understand better that God doesn't simply allow trials in the generic sense of where they just happen and it's like God's up there and he's like, oh, I didn't expect that to happen. I turned my head for a moment and the trial snuck in, so I guess I'll allow it. But God sends trials as a way to secure what is necessary for our perseverance.
Mhm.
And it's a means by which he uses to build within our faith and our relationship with him that which we will draw upon to endure. So, like in Romans 5, we rejoice in our sufferings, knowing that suffering produces endurance. Endurance produces character. Character produces hope. Or, James says, consider it all joy when you encounter various trials, knowing that the testing of your faith produces endurance. So there's this connection between trials and suffering and endurance. And it's so counterintuitive. You would never think that that's kind of the program, because we're always just trying to endure and get through trials, which is understandable. We're all the same that way. But in reality, God has kind of set up all of that to make an important investment into our life and into our character and into our faith, which can be achieved in no other way. So, we tend to think of loss and trials as things that have to be avoided at all costs, but God has actually embedded into the plan, he's embedded them into the plan for our perseverance.
Mm.
And as you've personally kind of walked through these things, and it's not like I mean, trials are a daily occurrence for every person. So I'm sure people listening to this podcast are on the spectrum of that. But walking through this one in particular, what are things that like experientially know about God, that maybe prior to that you knew theologically, you
Mm.
affirmed it, you knew it was true, but you've tasted of that reality
Mm.
that might
Well,
encourage somebody?
well, certainly one of them would be what I just pointed to about grace.
Yeah.
And it's worth mentioning again because it really was uh, it really was so deeply encouraging and so satisfying to the soul to be in this horrific experience and to experience in a tangible, palpable, quantifiable way the grace of God.
Mm.
But I also think that, when the writer of Hebrews goes to define faith, without faith it's impossible to please God. For whoever would believe him, or whoever would please him must believe that he exists and he's a rewarder of those who seek him. In other words, it's not just God's existence, but it's his goodness. And Christians don't tend to fight the battle on the side of God's existence as much in trial, but God's goodness often comes under serious question and serious evaluation, because we look for goodness in certain narrow ways, and we miss all of the goodness that takes place in the field in which God really works. And so we look for goodness through relief, and God's often not bringing it through relief. He's bringing it through experience of his grace in fellowship, or experiences of his grace in endurance, or just a thousand different things that are happening where the goodness of God is on display. And so I'd say, seeing God as not only real, but as a rewarder of those who seek him, and recognizing that's an expression of faith. In fact, perhaps the best measure of our faith is where we go when we're hurting, and what we trust when we're hurting, and the different things that we rush to reward us apart from God when we're hurting. And so I think the grace of God, and then the need to trust God, and feeling grace to trust God, but also to have to take that palpable step. See, the thing is, the experience of loss and grief is an emotional experience, and it necessarily so. And we don't want to deny that. We don't want to tamp that down. We have to give room for that to breathe. But emotions will not move you forward in grief. Emotions will ultimately lock you down if you just are always paying attention to emotions. So there's a sense where we have to give a wide field to emotions, but we have to recognize that they don't play the role of moving us forward, except maybe by diminishing a bit. In some ways, to move forward into the future, you have to deny certain emotions, and you have to do things that you see in Scripture that are right, which may not coincide with how you feel, but we know please God because they're in Scripture.
Dave,
Well, no, that's really helpful. Oh, I'm sorry, Nathan, go ahead.
I was just going to say thank you so much for that. I wanted to ask you, one of the themes that we've seen with our authors and speaking with them this month is the importance of community and not being alone in whatever it is you're going through, whether that be anxiety or depression. Can you speak to the role of community and the importance of community during your grief and loss, and how that has helped and touched you during that time?
Yeah, wow. Such a great question. Because the challenge of sudden loss is that you have a wave of decisions that need to be made on how to remember the one you lost, how to celebrate their life, and you have those decisions needing to be made at the very time when your mental faculties are shattered. And so for us, that's where friends and the church stepped in to help to guide us, and were prompting me on what things I need to be thinking about and things that need to be done. I mean, the ceremony, the funeral just represents dozens of decisions, when you think about it, which will help people engage their loss. And nobody wants to be in the position where you're actually having to think about other people, but these are people you love and people that you love that are hurting deeply. And so you're actually having to think about, okay, well, how do we want to remember well the one that we all love in a way that's going to be helpful? So you got all that coming at you. And that's where a community of people and wise pastors and church involvement is so important. Oh, so here's another facet of it is like church involvement is part of what helps in the long-term care of someone who is suffering loss or experiencing grief, because grief is often magnified because the relational response when people find out someone has passed, for instance, or maybe someone is hospitalized, but the relational response is rapid and intense. So you immediately have people rushing towards you. If you have family or if you have friends, they're moving toward you. So it's rapid, it's intense, but here's the thing, it's brief. And once that period passes, you are left alone with your feelings and your fears. And so when you're involved in a local church and you've got friends and you've got a small group and you've got a pastor, once the funeral passes, being in a church rolls your grief into the fabric of those relationships as a kind of ongoing touch point in your life. And so it can help you to fight the disillusionment and the lies that attack you once you are looking, like down the corridor of the future and all you see is loss. And to have people there that are saying, it's not going to be like this. And yeah, I know it's been a few months, or I know it's been a year, but it's not going to always be like this. And so I think, that has made a huge difference for us.
That's so helpful, Dave. And I'm glad, Nathan, you asked that question. I've always heard you, Dave, preach and teach on the importance of the church. It's for those that are just tuning in. That is something I know, Dave, you feel very, very deeply in terms of the place where God wants us to experience Him in such a special way. If I may piggyback on that briefly, it was not a question we had talked about earlier, but I think this would be good for a little self-serving here, pastors, but also churches knowing how to serve pastors. Because, Dave, I'm just curious, you have, for most of your adult life, I'm sure, been the caregiver, the answer person. And when you're feeling the swirl of emotions that might not always be neat and tidy and fit into a teaching or a preaching outline, to the degree you're comfortable, of course, did you have any struggle opening up to people? Because I'm sure people that you have taught and shepherded are now turning around and trying to help you. Was it just natural to do that because of the intensity of the grief? Was it something you sort of had to check your mind and heart on and make decisions about how much do I share about what I'm really feeling? Just curious how you walked through that.
I would say that first, it was natural, but that's not because of my character. That's not, and I understand anybody that would be watching this or listening to this and feeling like that seems so counterintuitive. But the thing is that by the grace of God, I've lived for a long time. Yes, being a pastor, yes, being a leader, but also being on teams and recognizing the importance of when you're on teams to both lead, but also to at times subordinate, to at times receive from others, and to receive care in particular. I think it can be unfortunate that we can be at times on teams and then come into the worst moments of your life and immediately feel like you need to outsource that in a sense, because you feel like the team around you is incompetent or incapable of caring for you, when really this is the moment that you build for. And so I think I've been able to enjoy that and experience that without feeling like I'm overexposing myself, or feeling like that somehow it's inappropriate to do so. So, within probably, an hour of everything happening with my daughter, there were a couple of pastors sitting in my house, and I felt very free to tell them. I mean, I didn't know how I felt, honestly. Kim and I processed things so differently. I was just stunned and oh, could hardly articulate, string sentences together. So, but you're sitting with people for whom that's okay. There are no expectations, and so I'm grateful I have that. I want to give my life to help provide that for others, and then also to help teams be built so that anytime anybody walks through that, they can enjoy that as well.
Wow. Hey, Dave, because you're talking about the life of the local church, and I know sometimes people, when they go through difficult times, what is supposed to play out in the life of a local church, it misfires. And sometimes in the church, and you've been in ministry for decades now, you've seen the best, and I'm sure you've seen some of the not so good of a local church just because of sin. What are some things that were most helpful of expressing care, God's grace to you, and maybe touch on maybe some things that maybe were well intended, but were, let's just say, less than helpful?
I think that I mentioned that Kim and I process things differently, and that would include how we grieve. And I mentioned earlier that we agreed early on that we weren't going to bring the ways that we grieve under criticism. Kim's a verbal processor, I'm an internal processor. That can be very tempting when you think you put those both in the same situation, and you've got an internal processor and a verbal processor. And the thing is, the point I'm getting at, though, is that regardless of which side of that you're on, both of those people require good listening to engage their grief. And so, the verbal processor has those feelings closer to the surface. Information and perspective and feelings are closer to the surface for a verbal processor. For internal processor, they're much deeper. But regardless, wise listening, careful listening, and good listening. So while Job's friends did a lot of things wrong, sitting and grieving with Job for 7 days before they said anything was not among them. That was a great example of meeting somebody in the middle of their incredible grief and not feel obligated to be the answer person, not feel obligated to bring the mysterious interpretation that eludes everybody else, to just be present. And then to remember also, and I think this was something that really helped me personally. And that was that Jesus doesn't just know about grief because of his omniscience. He knows grief as a human, as being fully human. So Isaiah, in Isaiah 53, he's a man of sorrows, acquainted with grief. And maybe the best picture of this is he's standing before the tomb of Lazarus. And what is it, like John 11 says, he was deeply moved and greatly troubled. So deeply moved, which is like a righteous indignation. So deeply moved doesn't quite capture exactly what's going on there. It's like a righteous indignation, and then greatly troubled, which is more like deeply disturbed. Like I think that one translation is like a shaking and a quaking with agitation over what's going on. And so you connect those two phrases of what's happening as Jesus is standing there. There's like this emotional eruption that's about to take place. And keep in mind, Jesus is the only one present who actually knows where this whole story is going. He knows, that in less than an hour, Lazarus is going to be tossing aside his grave clothes. And then so it says, that he was moved in his spirit, greatly troubled. And then it says, Jesus wept. Mm-hmm. So it just all kind of, again, there's this infinitely like precious picture of Jesus weeping, grieving in the face of death, in the face of brokenness, even though he knows that pretty soon Lazarus is just going to be standing right next to him. He knows that pretty soon his two sisters, their tears are going to be, they're going to turn into like this unconstrained joy. And this funeral is about to turn into this huge party. But there's something about just the brokenness of the world, the suffering, the death that inevitably decimates the ones that we love, that causes Christ himself, before he does this major miracle, to just stand there and weep. So my point is, Jesus gets grief, and we can flee to the sympathetic Savior, knowing that we will find grace and help for our time of need.
That's a great word for us, Dave. We want to thank you so much. We are unfortunately out of time. I mean, kind of looking at everybody on the screen here, I think we could have stayed here for another hour listening to you talk about this. It has been so wonderful to listen to your experiences, but also the things that God has been showing you and teaching you along the way as well has just been so very encouraging. So thank you so much. As Greg said early on, we do want to give away 2 of your books. I Still Do, Growing Closer and Stronger Through Life's Defining Moments. And so our listeners out there, if you can go ahead and just send us an email, or you can send us a Facebook message, you can tweet us, but mention specifically Dave Harvey in this podcast, and we will go ahead and put you into a drawing to receive to have a chance to win one of those 2 books that we are giving out. So, Dave, again, thank you so much. Such an honor and a privilege to have you here joining us.
Thanks, Nathan. Greg, nice to meet you. Matt, always good
seeing
to
you
see
again, Dave. Good seeing you.
All right. Well, gentlemen, we are going to go ahead and sign off now. Thank you again. Have a good evening, everyone.
Thank you again for listening to These Go to 11, an unchurchy conversation about everyday faith. Once again, please make sure you like, subscribe, and review on your favorite podcast platform. And if you ever find yourself in the Forest Hill, Maryland area, please feel free to stop by at 135 Industry Lane, and you can get all of our service times and information at christfc.org.
These Go to 11